Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. The horrifying case of the children the church tried to hide. In the autumn of 1882, when the leaves turned blood red across the Missouri Ozarks, whispers began to spread through the hollow valleys like morning fog. They spoke of children who had vanished without explanation, of strange sounds echoing from beneath the wooden floorboards of the Hollow Creek Baptist Church, and of a congregation bound by fear as much as faith. The locals who dared to speak of it at all would lower their voices to barely a whisper, glancing over their shoulders, as if the very trees might carry their words back to the white-clapboard building that stood at the heart of their small community. They told of late-night gatherings where no hymns were sung, of locked doors that should have remained open, and of a basement that seemed to swallow sound itself. But to understand the horror that unfolded in those remote hills, we must first journey back to a time when the wounds of war still festered, when isolated communities created their own laws, and when the word of a preacher could hold more power than any government official who might venture into those forgotten corners of America. The Missouri Ozarks of 1882 were a world unto themselves, carved from limestone bluffs and dense forests that had witnessed both Cherokee hunting parties and Confederate guerrillas. This was a landscape shaped by violence and solitude, where communities clung to ridgetops and river bottoms like survivors of some great flood. The Civil War had ended 17 years prior, but its echoes still reverberated through these hills, where families had chosen sides that split churches and divided neighbors for generations. In places like West Plains and Springfield, the larger towns that served as gateways to this wilderness, visitors could catch glimpses of civilization, telegraph lines, railroad depots, and newspapers that connected them to the broader world. But venture deeper into the White River Valley, follow the winding paths that led to settlements with names like Howell County and Shannon County, and you entered a realm where time seemed to move differently, where old ways persisted, and where the outside world felt more like a distant rumor than a present reality. These were communities bound together by necessity and faith, where a traveling preacher might be the only educated man for 50 miles, where his word carried the weight of divine authority simply because there was no other authority to challenge it. The people who carved lives from this unforgiving landscape were hardy folk, loggers and farmers, hunters and trappers, but they were also deeply religious, their faith forged in the same crucible of hardship that had shaped their bodies and minds. Religious revivals swept through the Ozarks like wildfire during this period, each promising salvation to souls who had endured so much earthly suffering. Baptists, Methodists, and smaller denominational groups established churches wherever they could gather a congregation, often in simple wooden structures that served multiple purposes: meeting house, school, and sometimes courthouse, all in one. The preachers who served these communities wielded enormous influence, for they were often the sole interpreters of not just Scripture, but of right and wrong, acceptable and forbidden. It was into this world of spiritual fervor and geographic isolation that Reverend Silas Dunmore arrived in the spring of 1879, establishing himself as the shepherd of a small but devoted flock that gathered each Sunday in the Hollow Creek Baptist Church. To those who met him, Dunmore presented himself as a man called by God to minister to the forgotten souls of the Ozark wilderness. Tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire, Reverend Dunmore possessed the kind of commanding presence that could hold a congregation spellbound for hours. His sermons were legendary throughout the region, passionate deliveries that began with gentle scripture and built to thunderous crescendos about sin, damnation, and the narrow path to salvation. Visitors who attended services at Hollow Creek would later describe feeling simultaneously inspired and unsettled, drawn to his magnetic personality, yet somehow disturbed by the intensity of his gaze. But it was not just his preaching that set Silas Dunmore apart from other ministers in the region. He claimed to practice what he called biblical discipline, a strict interpretation of Scripture that he insisted demanded harsh correction for even the smallest transgressions. Parents in his congregation were encouraged to bring their children to him for guidance, particularly those youngsters who showed signs of what he termed spiritual rebellion. The families who made up Dunmore's flock were typical of the region. Hard-working people who had known loss and struggle, who saw their harsh existence as a test of faith that would be rewarded in the afterlife. They trusted their preacher implicitly, believing that his harsh methods were necessary medicine for souls that might otherwise be lost to damnation. When Reverend Dunmore spoke of the need for severe correction, when he quoted scripture about sparing the rod and sesal, spoiling the child, they nodded in agreement, even when his interpretation seemed to go beyond anything they had heard before. But those outside his immediate congregation began to notice troubling patterns. Traveling merchants who stopped in the area reported strange sounds emanating from the church at odd hours. Not the joyful singing one might expect, but something else entirely. Neighbors living within earshot of the building whispered about screams that seemed to come from underground, about flickering lantern light visible through basement windows well past midnight, and about children who entered those church doors but were never seen to leave. As winter gave way to spring in 1882, these whispers began to center on specific children. Young members of the congregation who had seemingly vanished from the community without explanation. Their names would later be etched into the dark folklore of the Ozarks. But in life, they were simply children trying to navigate the treacherous waters of childhood in a world that demanded absolute obedience and unquestioning faith. Henry Dunmore, just 10 years old, was the preacher's own son, a quiet boy with his father's dark eyes, but none of his commanding presence. Those who knew him described a child who seemed perpetually afraid, who flinched at sudden movements and rarely spoke above a whisper. Henry had been seen less and less frequently in recent months, and when questioned, Reverend Dunmore would only say that the boy was receiving special instruction that required isolation from other children who might corrupt his spiritual development. Clara Whitfield was 12, the daughter of a widowed mother who had turned to the church for support after her husband died in a logging accident. Clara had always been a spirited child, quick to laugh and slow to accept authority without question, traits that apparently Morris ked her as in need of Reverend Dunmore's particular form of guidance. Her mother, desperate for any help in raising a daughter alone, had gratefully accepted the preacher's offer to provide additional religious instruction for the girl. 8-year-old Joseph Carter came from one of the region's more established families, descendants of early settlers who had claimed land along the Current River decades before the war. Joseph was known for his curiosity, his tendency to ask uncomfortable questions during Sunday school, and his habit of wandering off to explore the caves and hollows that dotted the landscape around their farm. His parents had hoped that Reverend Dunmore's firm hand might cure their son of what they saw as dangerous independence. These children, along with several others whose names have been lost to time and deliberate forgetting, formed a tragic constellation of young lives that would become forever linked to the dark events unfolding in the shadow of the Hollow Creek Baptist Church. They were not random victims, but carefully selected targets. Children whose natural spirits marked them as threats to the absolute authority that Silas Dunmore demanded from his flock. The first disappearance that truly alarmed the community occurred on a cold February morning when Henry Dunmore failed to appear for the breakfast his father usually required him to help prepare for visiting church officials. When questioned, Reverend Dunmore explained that Henry had been sent away to receive religious instruction from a colleague in another county, an opportunity too valuable to pass up despite the boy's young age. This explanation might have satisfied the congregation had similar incidents not begun occurring with increasing frequency. Clara Whitfield was next, supposedly sent to learn proper Christian domestic skills from a family in Arkansas. Joseph Carter followed soon after, allegedly placed with a minister in Tennessee who specialized in correcting wayward children. Each departure was explained as a wonderful opportunity, a chance for intensive spiritual education that would transform these troubled youngsters into model Christians. But the promised letters from these distant locations never arrived. Parents who inquired about their children were told that contact was forbidden during the initial period of instruction, that any communication might interfere with the important work being done to save their souls. Months passed without word, then seasons, until even the most trusting parents began to harbor doubts about their preacher's explanations. It was during this period that Father John Hogan, the Irish priest who had established a Catholic colony in Missouri and was known throughout the region for his progressive approach to education and child welfare, happened to pass through the area. Father Hogan had heard rumors about the unusual practices at Hollow Creek Baptist Church and took it upon himself to make inquiries about the missing children. His investigation would later prove to be the first crack in the wall of silence that surrounded Reverend Dunmore's activities. Father Hogan's questions forced local authorities to acknowledge what many had suspected, but none had dared to voice, that children were disappearing from the community, and their disappearances were somehow connected to the church that claimed to be saving their souls. But confronting a popular preacher about such serious allegations required more courage than most local officials possessed, particularly when that preacher could rally his entire congregation to his defense with a single sermon about persecution and false accusations. As spring turned to summer in 1882, the whispers that had begun as mere gossip began to take on a more sinister tone. Neighbors reported hearing sounds from the church that defied easy explanation. Not the crying of children exactly, but something that chilled the blood of anyone who heard it echoing across the hollow on still nights. Some claimed to have seen figures moving in the church basement after dark, shadows that seemed too small to be adults, but moved with a strange shuffling gait that suggested injury or restraint. Mrs. Sarah Clemens, an elderly widow who lived closest to the church building, began keeping a detailed diary of the strange occurrences she witnessed. Her entries, discovered years later, hidden beneath loose floorboards in her cabin, painted a picture of systematic horror that had been unfolding under the noses of an entire community, too frightened or too trusting to intervene. According to Mrs. Clemens' observations, the church basement was occupied nearly every night, with lantern light visible through the small windows well past midnight. She wrote of hearing what she described as instruction sessions, the sound of a single adult voice speaking in measured, threatening tones, punctuated by responses that sounded like children reciting lessons they had been forced to memorize. Most disturbing of all were the nights when the sessions ended with screaming, followed by an unnatural silence that seemed to press against her eardrums like a physical weight. The caves that honeycomb the limestone foundation of the Ozarks had always been part of the landscape's mystery and danger. Local children were warned against exploring the deeper caverns, where underground rivers could sweep away the unwary, and where it was all too easy to become lost in passages that stretched for miles beneath the earth. But in the summer of 1882, these same caves began to feature prominently in the increasingly frantic whispers of parents whose children had vanished. Hunters and trappers who knew the region's hidden places began reporting strange signs, evidence of recent human habitation in caves that had been empty for years, the remains of hastily abandoned campsites in hollows that seemed ocean more for concealment than comfort. Most unsettling of all were the reports from Shannon County, where several experienced cavers claimed to have heard voices echoing from deep within passages they had explored countless times before, voices that seemed to belong to children calling for help from somewhere far below the surface. The geographic isolation that had initially protected Reverend Dunmore's activities was beginning to work against him as word of the missing children spread beyond his immediate congregation. The current river, which had once been a barrier protecting the community from outside interference, now carried stories downstream to larger settlements where authorities might actually have the power and will to investigate. It was inevitable that these mounting suspicions would eventually reach the attention of someone with both the authority and the courage to act. That person turned out to be Sheriff Samuel Morrison, a former Union cavalry officer who had settled in West Plains after the war and built a reputation for fairness and determination that transcended the old divisions that still plagued much of the region. Sheriff Morrison had served under officers who understood that the most dangerous enemies were often those who hid behind facades of respectability, who used positions of trust to mask their true intentions. When the first formal complaints about missing children reached his office in the late summer of 1882, he approached the investigation with the same methodical care he had once applied to rooting out Confederate guerrillas who claimed to be peaceful farmers by day. The political pressure to act came from an unexpected source. Governor Thomas T. Crittenden himself, the former Confederate officer turned Republican politician who had made his reputation by taking on the James Gang and other outlaws who had terrorized Missouri West in the post-war years. Governor Crittenden had received a personal letter from Father John Hogan detailing his concerns about the situation in Howell County, and the governor understood that allowing such allegations to go uninvestigated would reflect poorly on his administration's commitment to law and order. Armed with gubernatorial authority and backed by a carefully selected team of deputies who had no connections to the local community, Sheriff Morrison arrived in Hollow Creek on a gray September morning that seemed to herald the end of summer and the beginning of something far darker. The investigation that followed would uncover evidence that challenged everything the local community thought they knew about the man they had trusted with their children's souls. The search of the Hollow Creek Baptist Church began at dawn and continued for 3 days, each hour revealing new horrors that had been hidden beneath layers of religious respectability and community trust. The main sanctuary, where families had gathered each Sunday to hear Reverend Dunmore's passionate sermons, showed no obvious signs of wrongdoing. But it was what lay beneath, in the basement that most congregation members had never been permitted to enter, that would provide the evidence needed to understand the true scope of the crimes that had been committed. The basement had been divided into several small rooms, each secured with heavy wooden doors that could only be locked from the outside. The walls showed signs of recent construction, suggesting that these chambers had been added after the church's original construction, built specifically to serve purposes that had nothing to do with worship or legitimate religious instruction. Most disturbing of all were the iron rings that had been bolted into the stone foundation walls, rings that showed clear evidence of having been used to restrain human beings for extended periods. But it was not just the physical evidence that painted a picture of systematic abuse and imprisonment. Hidden in a wooden chest behind the church's modest pulpit, investigators discovered detailed records that Reverend Dunmore had apparently kept of his activities. Records that read more like the notes of a sadistic jailer than the spiritual guidance one might expect from a man of God. These documents, written in Dunmore's careful hand, described correction sessions that went far beyond any reasonable interpretation of biblical discipline. They detailed methods of confinement and punishment that would have been considered extreme even by the harsh standards of the era, techniques designed not to correct behavior, but to break the spirit entirely. Most chilling of all were the clinical notes about the effectiveness of various methods, as if the preacher had been conducting some kind of twisted experiment on the children placed in his care. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Reverend Dunmore had not been working alone. Several members of his inner circle, trusted congregants who had been granted access to areas of the church forbidden to others, appeared to have been complicit in the systematic abuse of the missing children. These individuals, when confronted with the evidence, initially maintained their innocence, claiming they had been following the preacher's instructions without fully understanding their implications. As news of the investigation spread throughout the region, other witnesses began to come forward, people who had seen things they couldn't explain, heard sounds that had haunted their dreams, but had been too afraid or too uncertain to speak out earlier. Their testimonies painted a picture of a community that had been living in willful denial, choosing to trust in religious authority rather than confront the possibility that evil could hide behind a collar and a Bible. The children who had survived Reverend Dunmore's special instruction were eventually located in various hiding places throughout the region, some in remote cabins, others in caves that had been modified to serve as primitive prisons. Their testimonies, given in halting whispers to investigators who struggled to maintain their professional composure, revealed the full extent of the horror that had been unfolding in their community for months. 10-year-old Henry Dunmore, found in a cave system near the current river, had been subjected to his father's correction for the longest period. The boy, who had once been merely quiet and withdrawn, was now so traumatized that he could barely speak above a whisper, flinching away from any adult who approached too quickly. His testimony, given over several sessions with a patience that tested even experienced investigators, described a systematic program of physical and psychological torture designed to achieve absolute compliance. Clara Whitfield, discovered in an abandoned cabin in Shannon County, told of nights spent chained in the church basement, forced to listen to sermons about her supposed sins, while enduring punishments that grew progressively more severe whenever she showed any sign of spirit or independence. The 12-year-old girl, who had once been known for her laughter and curiosity, now exhibited the hollow-eyed stare of someone who had seen too much of humanity's capacity for cruelty. Joseph Carter, found in perhaps the most remote location of all, a cave system that required specialized equipment and local guides to access, described being told that his questions and curiosity were evidence of demonic possession that could only be cured through extreme measures. The 8-year-old boy's natural intelligence had been twisted into a source of shame and fear, his mind turned against itself by months of psychological manipulation. But perhaps the most disturbing testimonies came from children who had managed to escape Reverend Dunmore's clutches entirely, youngsters who had fled into the wilderness rather than endure another day of his spiritual guidance. These children, found living like wild animals in the forests and caves of the Ozarks, told of others who had not been so fortunate, children whose spirits had been broken so completely that they had simply stopped fighting, stopped trying to escape, stopped hoping for rescue. The adult members of Dunmore's congregation who had aided in these crimes painted themselves as victims of the preacher's manipulation, claiming they had been convinced that harsh methods were necessary to save children's souls from damnation. But their testimonies revealed a more complex truth. that the isolation and religious fervor of their community had created conditions where abuse could be reframed as righteousness, where torture could be justified as divine will. Mrs. Rebecca Morrison, who had helped prepare meals for the children during their imprisonment, testified that she had convinced herself the crying she heard was simply the result of necessary discipline, that the bruises and injuries she witnessed were the inevitable consequences of spiritual warfare against sin. Her testimony revealed how ordinary people could become complicit in extraordinary evil when their moral compass was overridden by religious authority and community pressure. Deacon James Hartwell, who had assisted in constructing the basement prison cells, claimed he had believed he was building rooms for intensive prayer and meditation, spaces where troubled children could be isolated from worldly distractions while they focused on their spiritual development. His testimony painted a picture of willful blindness, of a man who had chosen not to ask uncomfortable questions because the answers might have forced him to confront his own complicity. The testimonies of the terrified revealed not just the scope of the crimes that had been committed, but the psychological mechanisms that had allowed them to continue for so long. The combination of religious authority, community isolation, and carefully cultivated fear had created a perfect storm where abuse could flourish unchecked, where victims could be silenced and enablers could convince themselves they were serving a higher purpose. As the investigation continued through the autumn of 1882, it became clear that the full truth might never be known. Some children remained missing, their fate uncertain despite extensive searches of the region's caves and hidden places. Some witnesses remained too traumatized to provide coherent testimony, their minds shattered by experiences that exceeded their ability to process or communicate. The legal proceedings that followed would be complicated by the very isolation that had allowed the crimes to occur in the first place. Many of the potential witnesses were reluctant to testify against people they had known and trusted for years, torn between their desire for justice and their fear of destroying their community's social fabric. The defense attorneys hired to represent Reverend Dunmore and his accomplices would argue that their clients had been guided by sincere religious beliefs, that their methods might have been harsh, but their intentions had been pure. But even as the legal system struggled to assign appropriate punishment for crimes that seemed to exceed normal categories of wrongdoing, the damage to the community's social structure was already apparent. Families began leaving the area, unable to remain in a place where such horrors had been allowed to occur. Property values plummeted as word of the investigation spread to neighboring counties. The Hollow Creek Baptist Church itself was abandoned, its doors sealed, and its windows boarded up, as if the building itself had been contaminated by the evil that had occurred within its walls. The aftermath of the Hollow Creek investigation would ripple through the Missouri Ozarks for generations, creating a legacy of suspicion and unease that would color the region's relationship with religious authority for decades to come. Churches throughout the area found themselves under increased scrutiny, their pastors forced to submit to oversight that would have been unthinkable before the scandal broke. Parents became more protective of their children, less willing to trust them to the care of religious figures who claimed special authority over young souls. But perhaps the most lasting impact was the way the community chose to handle the memory of what had occurred. Rather than confronting the full implications of their collective failure to protect their most vulnerable members, many chose instead to bury the story, to treat it as an aberration that could be forgotten if it was simply not discussed. Church records from the period were mysteriously lost or destroyed. Newspaper accounts were brief and sanitized. Official reports focused on legal technicalities rather than the human cost of the crimes. This deliberate forgetting created its own form of trauma. a community-wide case of suppressed memory that manifested in whispered stories and half-remembered warnings passed down through generations of families who had learned not to ask too many questions about the past. The children who had survived Reverend Dunmore's abuse were encouraged to put their experiences behind them, to focus on healing rather than dwelling on what had been done to them. Some families changed their names and moved to distant counties, hoping to escape the stigma of having been associated with the scandal. Others remained, but withdrew from community life, becoming isolated and suspicious in ways that marked them as different, even when their neighbors couldn't quite remember why. The social fabric of the region was permanently altered, marked by invisible scars that would influence patterns of trust and suspicion for generations. The legal consequences for those involved were surprisingly limited, hampered by the difficulty of prosecuting crimes that existed in a legal gray area between child abuse, false imprisonment, and religious practice. Reverend Silas Dunmore himself disappeared before he could be brought to trial, vanishing into the wilderness he had claimed to serve with such dedication. Some believed he had fled to Mexico or California, seeking to establish new congregations far from the reach of Missouri law. Others whispered that he had met a more final justice in the caves and hollows he had used to hide his crimes. His accomplices faced a variety of charges, but many received surprisingly lenient sentences after expressing remorse and claiming they had been misled by their trusted spiritual leader. The complexity of prosecuting crimes that had been committed under the guise of religious authority, combined with the reluctance of many witnesses to testify, resulted in legal outcomes that seemed inadequate to the scope of the suffering that had been inflicted. But the law was only one form of justice, and in the tight-knit communities of the Ozarks, other forms of accountability were often more effective than official sanctions. Several of the adults who had been complicit in the abuse found themselves shunned by their neighbors, unable to find work or maintain social relationships in places where their involvement was known. Some left the region entirely, seeking fresh starts in places where their reputations had not been tainted by association with the scandal. As the seasons passed and the immediate shock of the investigation began to fade, the story of what had happened at Hollow Creek Baptist Church began its transformation, from recent history into local legend. The process was gradual but inexorable, as facts became mixed with speculation, as verified details were combined with folklore and superstition, as the uncomfortable truth was slowly buried beneath layers of more palatable myth. The transformation was assisted by the natural human tendency to make sense of incomprehensible events by placing them in familiar narrative frameworks. The story of Reverend Dunmore became a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting charismatic leaders without question. The missing children became martyrs whose suffering served as a warning to future generations. The abandoned church became a haunted site where the spirits of the wronged supposedly lingered to ensure their story would not be completely forgotten. Local storytellers, the informal historians who preserved and transmitted community memory through oral tradition, began to add their own embellishments to the tale. They spoke of strange lights still visible in the abandoned church windows on certain nights, of voices that could be heard calling from the sealed basement when the wind was right, of children's footprints that appeared in the dust around the building, despite the fact that no living child would dare approach the cursed structure. These additions served multiple psychological functions for a community still struggling to process what had occurred in their midst. The supernatural elements provided a sense that cosmic justice was being served, even when human justice had proved inadequate. The ghost stories created a form of memorial for the victims, while simultaneously warning others to stay away from places where such evil had occurred. The caves and hidden places where children had been imprisoned became part of an alternative geography of the region, locations that local guides would point out to visitors while telling abbreviated versions of the story that emphasized the supernatural elements over the human failings that had made the crimes possible. These sites took on an almost sacred quality, places where the boundary between the natural and supernatural world seemed thinner than elsewhere. Hikers and hunters who ventured into the remote areas where evidence of the crimes had been found reported strange experiences that seemed to confirm the supernatural interpretation of events. They spoke of hearing children's voices calling from deep within cave systems, of finding evidence of recent habitation in places that had been abandoned for decades, of feeling watched by unseen eyes while exploring the hollows and ridges where the investigation had uncovered its darkest secrets. But beneath the layers of folklore and supernatural interpretation, the basic facts of what had occurred remained unchanged. Children had been taken from their families under the pretense of religious instruction and subjected to systematic abuse by adults they had been taught to trust. A community had failed to protect its most vulnerable members, choosing instead to defer to religious authority even when that authority was clearly being abused. The parents who had lost children to Reverend Dunmore's predations faced a particular form of torment, torn between grief for their loss and guilt over their failure to recognize the danger their children had faced. Some, like Clara Whitfield's mother, spent the remainder of their lives searching for children who had never been found, following rumors and reports that led them to distant counties and neighboring states in a quest that became its own form of penance. Others, like the families of children who had been recovered but deeply traumatized by their experiences, faced the challenge of helping young minds heal from wounds that seemed to exceed their capacity for recovery. The medical understanding of psychological trauma was limited in the 1880s, leaving parents to navigate their children's healing process through trial and error, love and patience, hope and desperation. The broader community grappled with questions that had no easy answers. How could so many people have been deceived for so long? What signs had they missed or chosen to ignore? How could they prevent such things from happening again? The answers, when they came at all, were complex and uncomfortable, forcing acknowledgement of the ways that isolation, authority, and fear could combine to create conditions where evil could flourish. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th century began, the story of the Hollow Creek Baptist Church became part of the broader narrative of the Missouri Ozarks, one thread in the complex tapestry of a region that had known violence and hardship, triumph and tragedy, saints and sinners in equal measure. But it remained a thread that many preferred not to examine too closely, a part of the pattern that was acknowledged but not discussed, remembered but not celebrated. The abandoned church building itself became a physical monument to the events, its boarded windows and sealed doors serving as a constant reminder of what had occurred within its walls. Local authorities made periodic attempts to demolish the structure, but each effort was somehow frustrated by lack of funds, by legal complications, by the simple difficulty of organizing collective action around something the community preferred not to think about. So the building remained, slowly deteriorating under the assault of weather and time, becoming more haunted-looking with each passing season. Vines grew over its walls, boards warped and fell from its windows, and its roof developed leaks that stained the walls with rusty streaks that looked disturbingly like dried blood in certain lights. The cemetery behind the church, where several generations of local families had been buried, was gradually reclaimed by the forest as families chose to inter their dead elsewhere rather than visit a site associated with such dark memories. Headstones were overgrown by vegetation. Graves were obscured by fallen leaves and encroaching undergrowth, and the entire area took on the appearance of a place that had been deliberately forgotten. But forgetting, as the community would learn, was not the same as healing. The trauma that had been inflicted could not be erased simply by refusing to discuss it, and the questions that had been raised could not be answered by changing the subject. The scars left by the events of 1882 would continue to influence the region for generations, shaping patterns of behavior and belief in ways that were not always obvious, but were nonetheless real. Children growing up in the area would absorb warnings and prohibitions that their parents could not fully explain, learning to avoid certain places and distrust certain types of authority without understanding why. Parents would become overprotective in ways that seemed excessive to outsiders, but made perfect sense to those who carried the buried memory of what had happened when trust was misplaced and vigilance was relaxed. The religious communities of the region would struggle with questions of authority and accountability that had been thrust upon them by the scandal, developing new forms of oversight and transparency that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. The easy trust that had once been granted to spiritual leaders would never fully return, replaced by a more complex relationship that acknowledged both the need for religious guidance and the dangers of unchecked spiritual authority. As decades passed and the witnesses to the original events aged and died, the story would survive primarily in the form of folklore and local legend, passed down through families and communities as a cautionary tale whose details might vary, but whose essential message remained constant. Evil could hide behind the most respectable facade. Death, and the price of failing to remain vigilant, was paid by the most innocent and vulnerable members of society. The caves and hidden places of the Ozarks would retain their association with the dark events, becoming part of a landscape of memory that told the story of what had occurred through geography rather than explicit narrative. Visitors to the region would hear fragments of the tale from local guides and storytellers, usually presented as historical curiosity rather than recent tragedy, entertainment rather than education. But for those who knew how to read the signs, the abandoned church, the overgrown cemetery, the caves that local children were still warned to avoid, the families whose genealogies showed mysterious gaps and relocations in the 1880s, the full story remained visible, written in the landscape and embedded in the collective unconscious of communities that had learned to carry trauma without acknowledging its weight. The questions that had been raised by the investigation would echo through American history as similar scandals emerged in other times and places, as other communities faced the challenge of reconciling their faith in authority with evidence of that authority's abuse. The specific details of what had happened in the Missouri Ozarks in 1882 might be forgotten or transformed into legend, but the underlying patterns would repeat themselves whenever conditions aligned to create similar opportunities for predation and exploitation. And so the story persists, neither fully remembered nor completely forgotten, existing in that liminal space between history and folklore where the most uncomfortable truths often reside. It serves as a reminder that evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs, that the most dangerous predators are often those who are trusted most completely, and that the price of protecting the innocent is eternal. Vigilance against those who would exploit our willingness to trust. In the end, the horrifying case of the children the church tried to hide remains what it was from the beginning. A dark chapter in American history that reveals uncomfortable truths about authority, community, and the capacity for both good and evil that exists within human nature. It stands as testimony to the resilience of those who survived, a memorial to those who did not, and a warning to future generations about the vigilance required to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The whispers that began in the autumn of 1882 have never fully ended, carried forward through generations of families who remember just enough to remain wary. just enough to pass on warnings they cannot fully explain, just enough to ensure that the children who suffered and died in the shadow of the Hollow Creek Baptist Church will not be completely forgotten, even if their story has been transformed into something more palatable than the harsh reality of what they endured. The Missouri Ozarks continue to harbor their secrets, hidden in caves and hollows that most will never explore, preserved in the collective memory of communities that have learned to live with the knowledge that evil once walked among them, wearing the face of righteousness. And somewhere in those dark places, if the stories are to be believed, the spirits of the children still call out for justice, for remembrance, for someone to tell their story completely and truthfully, without the comfortable distance of folklore or the softening filter of time. Their voices, whether real or imagined, serve as a reminder that some debts can never be fully paid, some wounds never completely healed, some stories never entirely concluded. They are the price we pay for the privilege of forgetting and the cost of choosing comfort over truth, authority over accountability, faith over vigilance. The case remains open in the court of history, its verdict still pending, its lessons still unlearned by each new generation that assumes such things could never happen in their time, in their community, to their children. The shadows beneath the steeple continue to lengthen, and the questions that were raised in 1882 remain as relevant today as they were then. Who watches the watchers? Who protects the protectors? And what price are we willing to pay for the privilege of trust? In the Missouri Ozarks, where the past lives on in whispered stories and abandoned buildings, in caves that echo with remembered screams and churches that stand empty as monuments to betrayed faith, the answer to those questions remains as elusive as ever. The children whose suffering began this story may have found peace at last, but their legacy lives on in the vigilance of those who remember, in the skepticism of those who learned too late to question authority, and in the enduring belief that some truths are too important to remain buried, no matter how uncomfortable they make us feel. The horrifying case of the children the church tried to hide is not just a story from the past. It is a mirror held up to every generation, reflecting our capacity for both faith and doubt, trust and suspicion, protection and abandonment. It asks us to examine our own communities, our own authorities, our own willingness to speak out when something seems wrong, even when that something is cloaked in respectability and defended by those we have been taught to trust. The answer to those questions, like the fate of some of the children who vanished in 1882, remains hidden in the shadows beneath the steeple, waiting for someone brave enough to bring them into the light. This story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.